And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Hello everybody and welcome back to the podcast. Today I'm here with Dr. Bamo Nouri, a lecturer at the University of West London teaching international politics. And today he's going to be talking with us, he's going to be talking about everything that is America, including foreign policy to Americanism and the American dream as a whole. I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you very much, Bamo, for being on the podcast today.
My pleasure.
Give us a little intro into what it is you teach your students and what it is you write about, because you are an author as well.
Yeah, I'm very interested in American power, power dynamics, and also what is power to America?
Right.
When do we know America is using their power? And what does this power look like, essentially? These are the kind of key areas that initially interested me, and more specifically because of my background. I'm from the Middle East, from Iraq, the Kurdish part originally. I was very interested in why theory didn't meet practice in the Iraq War. And also, I think growing up, this whole fascination with America, the whole kind of, from movie scenes to all the things that we do are essentially Americanisms, and conducting a study to really see, what happened in the Iraq War and how should we look at American power. So that's kind of where my research interests are: American foreign policy, American domestic politics, the drivers of the American political system, and also the impacts and repercussions that this has on subject nations when US imperialism takes place.
Right, okay, just one thing. Let's bring the mic a bit closer to you, just a slight bit.
Yep.
All right. Is that okay enough?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. Okay. I want to talk about the soft power first, something that most people wouldn't even consider to be power. Because when me and you had the conversation leading up to this podcast, you kind of blew my mind with the essence that America was sharing its culture, but also making itself more powerful by doing this. So we talked about movies, we talked about American pop culture. Just tell us about that. It was fascinating for that to be such a key as to why people try to move to America.
Definitely. I think there's two ways of imposing your will on subject nations, right? So the traditional way, as we kind of know in history, is physical, territorial imperialism through warfare and battle. The other, more smart way is ideological. So penetrating minds and making people think and behave in a particular way and have particular attitudes towards you and your power. And what America does that's quite effective is that it makes its own interest become the interest of its subject nations. Hence you have something called the liberal international order, where America is the leading hegemon, and this is like a willful setup, if you like, where America leads and the rest of the world follows. But for soft power, it's the ability to get your subjects, or those that you want to influence, to do things that go against their interests sometimes, but not always necessarily, but they predominantly serve your interests. And you can do that through so many different ways, and that goes from knowledge production, creating particular narratives in history and telling history in a particular way, through to pop culture, through to media, film, creating particular images. And if you look at, I think what's fascinating is, about a year ago I was looking at the Rocky movies again, and they were made towards the end of the Cold War. So you see these kind of depictions of the evil
American hero
versus the American hero, and the American hero is just an average guy just like you, but there's always that kind of divineness, that kind of extra super power that always overcomes against all odds.
You fall in love with the character.
That's it.
Essentially fall in love with America.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
And it all takes place subconsciously. It's not because your conscious is focused on the entertainment, but the subconscious is where all these Americanisms are picked up. And then you want to be the hero. You want to look like Rocky. You want to be that guy that is seen to be received well, and you want that fame, and you want that kind of cultural embrace.
I do think it's brilliant. Patriotism kind of does stem from the fact of loving your country, and America definitely took that to another level, especially in the 1900s. And only recently have we seen a type of divide within America, which we'll talk about later. But other movies that I want to touch on are things like The Pursuit of Happiness, The Founder, the story of McDonald's, which is so amazing. The Great Gatsby is another movie talking about the American dream. But also something that I think symbolizes the American dream is the Statue of Liberty. And it is such a big symbol of America because, firstly, it's monumental, it's massive, everybody wants to see it. But secondly, the fact that you named it the Statue of Liberty, that word in itself says everything. And that makes people want to not only, I think, not to be too bold here, but want to be American.
Yeah.
Literally want to be American.
Definitely.
Because think about, off the top of your head, so many things that are engraved within American culture, like Hollywood, New York, Los Angeles itself in general, Las Vegas. It's such a big thing. Someone like me who's never even been to America, I know so much about that country. And simply through its entertainment above all else.
Yep, definitely. And if there was to be some sort of ideological war, you'd always pick that American or Western side because that's the side that you're so familiar with and you've grown to somehow ingrain as part of your own daily life. But it's interesting, the things that you mentioned are all disseminations of a very, very strong foundation.
Yeah.
So if you look at America's birth, right from the get-go, 1776, you've got 13 states along the East Coast. These 13 states, they're all different cultures, different backgrounds, different visions, completely divided America, right? Yet through one set of ideology, a constitution that starts with we, the people, they come together and they come up with this idea that, we're different, we're unique, this is the land of opportunity, the land of the free, at a time when the rest of the world are essentially at war. There's a feudal war going on. Everyone else is kind of fighting to keep you within your, caste. If you're in a particular caste, you're a pauper, you don't marry above. And if you're, royalty, you don't marry below. The world is kind of rigged in that, retrogressiveness. And America's coming out saying, look how divine we are. We're born free. And all we need to do to be good Americans is to go and spread this divine way because people need it. It's our responsibility. Then you have the east to west expansion, which is in less than 200 years. America becomes 50 states. And when America kind of reaches its pinnacle on its own continent, it's this idea of, wait a minute.
Where to now?
Where, we need to cross the shores and the borders. And then you look at the work of the, foundations in America. And the way they then start to think ahead and then they invest. Okay, we want to go to Asia, but we know nothing about Asia. What do? We want to go to Indonesia, we want to go to Africa. Okay, go and fund, get the foundations, Ford, Carnegie, Rockefeller. They start funding all these different courses about Indonesia. Bring your Indonesian students here, send our Americans there, create scholarships. And every single nation that America has intervened in, be it, culturally or in terms of imperialism or overthrown a regime, it had already penetrated it through knowledge.
Psychologically.
Yeah, beforehand. But when, to kind of break it down beyond the psychological, the knowledge and America's ideas would become embedded in society.
Right.
Give you an example. Chile, I think in the 60s they had maybe 40 or 50 economists. I think it's definitely a number less than 100. But by the kind of 70s, before the uprising or the revolution, where one democratically elected Allende was then replaced by the dictator Pinochet, you had over 200 US educated economists that already were pro-American in their ideas and their pursuits and their direction. So it's seeing how there's so much value in knowledge and getting knowledge to different societies and then seeing how those societies open up based on these principles of freedom and liberty.
It's the idea of opportunity for all.
Yeah.
And one thing that you mentioned as well before we came on was you said not only do they sing the national anthem before every game, before every major event, but also in the classrooms, and it's particularly called allegiance to the flag, which I think here's where America separates itself from most of the other world, especially when they did this 200, 300 years ago. They said allegiance to the flag at a time when everyone was saying allegiance to the king, allegiance to the general, allegiance to any monarch. And to this day, there are many countries like that, and that's where they fall short. Because it's one thing to make people feel like they are part of an expanding ideology, and it's another thing to make people feel like they are no more than your subjects.
Yeah.
Especially when and again, this still exists to this day, where you look at yourself, you're a regular man, woman, working very hard, probably have many kids just to try and survive, right? And then there's the leader who wants nothing but your allegiance. He's in a big house, doesn't work hard for anything, his kids get everything. So do you think with America, when they set all of this up, it wasn't necessarily to manipulate, but to also set themselves apart from the rest of the world?
I think it was a solution at the time, but there was a genuine moral and spiritual investment in this. There was strong beliefs in this idea that America's divine, America's exceptional, America's chosen, right? Yeah. From there, you can't really measure how that will disseminate. A lot of things, it's impossible to measure what the consequences of those particular ideas are, but for Americans, they really believed in it. And then by the kind of early 1800s, this became a formal propaganda tool to, get people to expand, Americans to expand westwards. Come on, go towards the west. Go, if you want to be a good American, expand westwards. Go against the elements. Exactly. And what were the elements? Native or Indian Americans, or Native Americans, if you want to call them. Go against them, and also go against the land. Go and cut the trees down and turn it into houses. So many wooden houses at the time. And it's interesting that ideology was then used to justify a lot of warfare at the time, a lot of killing of innocent Native Americans, and it was all justified because this is something that it's a divine,
it's us versus them.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so embedded then, and if you look at it now, it's even more so, because it's transformed tenfold and it's morphed tenfold into even bigger things now. It's cultural, it's the whole world knows about America, but at that particular point it was, let's expand from 13 states and conquer this continent because we are chosen, we need to. And I think when you believe in something that much, you question how much somebody can be held accountable as well for the actions that they cause, because this is an ideology that influences people. Sometimes I think about the Iraq War and the book that I've written there. Even though I hold these elites accountable for their actions, I also ask the important question of, are they just products of this ideology, of this successful ideology? And some people call this an indoctrination, but I call it a powerful ideology. So if you're so embedded in the ideology, how accountable are these people then, as opposed to them acting off their own individual ideas? Because this is more of a collective idea that makes you go and look at any other country in a way that's less than you. I mean, one of the studies that I'm working on at the moment is in 1844 the US worked on the Treaty of Wangia, which was basically a treaty that gave US citizens extraterritoriality, or if you like, it made US citizens immune from Chinese law. So if a US citizen went to China, they were basically it's like as if they're in America. And the basis was that we don't want any American to be bound by Oriental law. So this kind of creating a alternate world of no accountability for Americans didn't just happen in 2003 in the Iraq War. It also happened, in all these different historical examples.
I have 2 points to make. First one being, I think throughout history this is a bit of a pattern, not just for America but for many countries. A lot of countries fall in love with their own ideologies, and a country that's doing that right now, probably more than anybody else, is China, which again we'll come back to at a later stage. Because the question becomes then, is it that America or the ideology is corrupt, or is it as humans do we find ourselves trying to mold ourselves into better than the other person? Because is it an insecurity of, if I don't tell you I'm better than the other person, if I don't show you, you might not respect and want me as much? And also something that's really big, because again it shows the unity within America, and everything starts from the top, doesn't it? This is something we're going to go into. Everything starts from the top. So when John F. Kennedy said in a very famous speech, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Yeah.
Come on, bro. At a time when social media doesn't exist, TVs are not brand new, but basically in everyone's house.
Yeah.
For the world leader to say that, it's got to be things like that, isn't it? It's not just... I think it starts at home. That's what I'm trying to say. So you said they expanded it to to make sure that Oriental laws didn't touch Americans. But I'm saying it started even before that. It starts,
of course.
With their leaders.
Of course, I mean, as we said right from the get-go, the very idea of America is born imperial. It's born fighting. It's like a baby coming out the womb, going against all the different elements, the nurses, the doctors, everybody around it, apart from its own, mother or its own relatives. If you look at the example in that way, then 100% it's a top-down ideology. But the way that the ideology disseminates, and it's that there was a particular quote, I can't remember the author now, but it's, if you condition people to believe in a particular set of rules, then you don't need to invest in tools, for example, to imprison those people or to control those people. So if you make people accept the rules that you give to them or the ways of life that you recommend, then they will basically just conform to that. You don't need to invest as much in police and security because they're happy to work within that framework. This ideology started top down and was constantly regurgitated in different ways by different leaders and adapted as per the times in particular moments. So in every president that the US has ever had, you've seen Americanisms in their speeches, in their, our country has a history of blah, 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 and I'm contributing to it in this way, I'm carrying this on. There's always that continuity, 100%. But once an ideology is so powerful and it's so complete in terms of its kind of foundations, because here you've got a constitution that was written 200 years ago or over however long ago, and then from there it still stays relevant because you've got a Supreme Court that translates it according to the times. Obviously there's implications with the Supreme Court and there's criticisms of it, but once that ideology is kind of molded, the way it disseminates in society through empowering people, you can't control that. For example, when let's say a Steve Jobs is creating a Apple startup, he's thinking he's serving his country, he's being a true American, a hero. America wants to be the best, it wants to do all these things. Microsoft, all these different pioneering initiatives, they come as a result of that ideology. Hence there's no country that matches what America has produced or been able to, because the ideological push isn't there. And then once you have an ideology embed in society, and if that ideology is progressive and an enabling ideology, then the way it disseminates is beautiful, because all you're going to have is synergies of people creating and coming up with new ideas, and there's competition to see who can do more in a kind of productive way. But then in a, let's say, authoritarian tyrannical regime where everybody's ideas are controlled and only the state can come up with new ideas to maintain order, then you see the retrogression there. And it's no idea, there's no mystery how no other country can match America's output or ever be able to, because it just doesn't have the enabling society. It takes centuries to build. And
in that sense, of course, that's credit to America.
100%.
Credit where credit's due. And sometimes people start to hate the successful. But just to jump on your point about the companies, a list of other companies for the people listening, if you want to know what came out of America. So we talked about Apple, talked about Microsoft, Amazon, Google, SpaceX, NASA, Blue Origin, Tesla, Coca-Cola, Facebook, Walmart, Intel, Disney, Marvel, Starbucks, McDonald's, Costco, Twitter, and we could probably fill another 100 companies. So my point, I didn't list this for bandits, my point is, this country, to feed an ideology, fake or not, I think, sat here, I think it's a necessary evil. I believe if this ideology doesn't exist, America wouldn't be as successful. And I also feel like the strongest things, whether it's an ideology of a nation or a religion, are things that can be stuck to right from the beginning. So if you talk about, not to go off too much on a tangent, but if you talk about Islam or Christianity, pretty much has stayed the same since the dawn of its creation. And only when things can stay the same can they be truly admired throughout history, because once you start letting people mess around with it, change it, then you're loosening that string and you're basically saying what I've created is adjustable.
Yeah.
Whereas when you don't let anyone touch it, what you've created is perfect, so to speak, isn't it? Yeah. But if I can just ask you, because we'll move on to foreign policy and everything else, Tell me about the American dream. Specifically, tell me about Bamo growing up and being influenced with American culture without even realizing it.
I think for me, I grew up watching, obviously I was in a Middle Eastern household, both parents very, very into politics, being Kurdish, always looking into the news to see what's happening in the Middle East, be it the Palestinian cause, be it what's happening in Iraq, what's happening to the Kurds. So my kind of escape was when I wasn't, being shut off by parents telling me to, get off the TV, was to watch cartoons. So be it, Dexter's Lab on Cartoon Network, to so many different films that I used to watch with my mum. All these things, they, without me knowing, they influence. I remember I used to watch a series, I was telling my wife about this recently, Martial Law, with a guy called Sammo Hung. Have you heard of Martial Law?
I haven't.
It's a 90s series. I think there was only 2 seasons of it, or 3 seasons, I'm not sure. I said to her, so we're going to buy it and watch it, but I think it's only available on DVD now or something.
Try Amazon. Try
Amazon,
Prime.
yeah. I've checked on Prime.
Oh, really?
Actually, yeah. Ironically, it wasn't on there. It's one of the key ones that if I could watch it again, I would. But I remember watching that and seeing these guys. They were policemen. They were part of, I think, the FBI, and they were just getting the bad guys, driving around in Porsches, getting all the nice women. I was thinking, wow, this must be everyone's dream. This is what I want to be when I grow up. And I remember wanting to get a convertible at like 23 years of age, simply because I'd watched one of the guys that I looked up to have a convertible, and I used to watch wrestling and all these things. And these are all just simple entertainment ways into my mind to make me think that's the way to be. But you'd hear these guys as well talking in interviews, I want to be you watch a Rocky movie, I want to be the greatest, I want to be the best ever, nobody can stop me. And it's always about getting bigger, getting stronger, and just that want for the best. So in many ways, the ideology, or I won't say ideology, I'll say Americanism, can be such a positive, productive thing. But at the same time, because it's so ceaseless and it's so limitless and endless in that regard, you can live a whole lifetime chasing this idea of being the best, keep producing good outputs, keep, conquering, keep growing. And that can be very, very damaging to the brain, and it can also spark your ego in a bad way. But I remember growing up, that was a big inspiration to want to look a particular way, to want to have a goatee, to want to be ripped and to dress and to look a particular way. All these things were massive influences on me. And I even think like going into university, playing football when I was younger, always wanting to be the best, that I didn't come up with that. My parents didn't come up with that. My parents are very, very grounded people. It's not part of my culture to be like that. But it's definitely the Americanism, eating all the right things, and just this kind of ambition, not just in one area, every area. And that kind of multi-dimensional juggernaut that wants to do everything to the maximum. So I think those things had a massive influence on me. Without even knowing, you watch cartoons like Simpsons, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, all the different things, wanting big trainers or sneakers, as Americans call it, Jordans, all these things.
Jordan brand right now.
Yeah, Jordan, all these things, they penetrate your mind, and you think, okay, to be like X, I need to have those clothes, I need to eat those foods, I need to look this particular way, when really it's all an illusion. There's no kind of factual basis to it. If you think about it, it's just what you create in your head, but it's so powerful. And when you're young with an undeveloped brain, this is a big thing for you.
Yeah, so you have to start early. When you touched on wrestling, something came to mind which is very iconic, because this man embodied what America wanted their men to represent, which is Hulk Hogan.
Yeah.
But I didn't just touch on Hulk Hogan for the sake of it. A very interesting thing about Hulk Hogan, you might remember this. There were 2 foreign wrestlers that were his biggest adversaries, if you remember. Andre the Giant and the Iron Sheik. And Vince McMahon is an intelligent man, the owner of WWE. He didn't do this by accident.
No.
He wanted to feed that America versus the rest of the world ideology. not just within the crowd, but through the TV, throughout history. You think of Hulk Hogan and the song comes to mind straight away. You know, talking about I'm a real American. Bro, I've actually, the more I look into it, the more I'm impressed. America really, really did a number and inspired generations across the pond, so to speak, in the UK and back home. But one thing I was going to say is, it's not all just a fallacy, so to speak, because if we look at the American economy, the American family, I think between post-World War II and especially in the Ronald Reagan era, they really did flourish, didn't they?
Yep.
People who worked and that weren't in high-level jobs, for example, people who worked for General Motors. General Motors was really big back then. So, with all due respect, that's not a very high-skilled job to fit a door on a car, right? And yet they would have a nice middle income lifestyle. They could take their kids on holiday. They could afford a car. They could afford a TV.
Mm-hmm.
So, was that the peak of the American dream?
I think the American dream, or the American kind of economy, if you like, it's always going to have peaks and troughs. There's going to be moments where policy has to change in order to deal with some sort of existential crisis. That's not going to necessarily go away, forever, where everything will always be peaceful. Based on the state of the world, America's own foreign policy, and it's made decisions that have impacted its credibility numerous times. I wouldn't say it was the peak. I think you could say the peak is even now. It's before Trump. Any period could be seen as a peak. It depends who you are and how it serves you in that particular moment. I don't think there'll ever be a time where everybody's 100% content. You might have favorability ratings, but the economy will always impact people in different ways as part of the setup of it.
The reason why I particularly mentioned that time period was because looking at the American economy, I feel like over those few decades, there wasn't as much of a gap between the rich and the poor. Whereas, especially after the banking crisis, basically when at the end of George Bush's reign, George Bush Jr., all the way to after Obama, there was a big chasm of difference between the poor and the rich, and that only started to expand. But I think in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the reason I call it peak times is because I think equality seemed to be there financially, not just in freedom and liberty. Because they have their laws
in practice, not just in rhetoric. Yeah. I think you could definitely say that was a golden era, 100%, for many people simultaneously, because nowadays it's much harder to bridge that wealth inequality gap. But I think at that point it probably was. But then at the same time, you could argue that it was during a Cold War era, which was in itself a very, very difficult, long period of trouble and issues for America as well. So it's kind of looking at the political side and the way the American people lived in that particular time in terms of how content they were is also something that you could probably take into consideration and argue the other way. But I think, definitely, wealth inequality wise, 100%.
So I don't want to be repetitive, but give us a brief outline of how America actually won, because here you have two powerhouses. You have Russia, Soviet Union, whatever you want to call it, and America.
Yeah.
Two nations with, so to speak, opposite ideologies.
Yeah.
But yet, one of them came out and won much better than the other. Is there a certain explanation for that?
I think I'm no Cold War expert. I'll say that my expertise is kind of American historical, foundations, if you like, from its inception throughout. In terms of the Cold War, what I would say, based on having talked about it previously, is that it was a long game. It was a big ideological battle.
Yeah.
And in the end, if you think about it logically, one ideology wants to imprison you and wants to kind of hold you in and control you. And as part of that ideology of the USSR and communism at its peak, it wasn't just equality for all. There were elites that benefited from this system.
Of course.
There was still a lot of corruption in society. So it wasn't a perfect ideology to kind of rant and rave about. And the only real incentive was to find a way to curb America in and to portray America as this imperialist that wants to push its ideas on you. So that's illogical in itself. It's a difficult argument to sustain. You can sustain it in societies where people are not as educated. You can control their TVs and, you know, what they watch. Maybe you can do it for so long, but you can't. There's that saying, you can fool some of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. America's push for ideology at that particular time, it was, logically speaking, it's difficult to argue with the enabling aspects of Americanism, of capitalism at that particular time, especially at a time when so many poor societies are in desperate need of regeneration, of opportunities, you know, working with dignity and breaking free from those realms of control. That played a big factor. But I think in the end the USSR was just completely depleted, you know, very, very tired and fatigued by the whole setup, and it was a waiting game towards the end. It wasn't like a big finale clash. You know, it was a...
Yeah, they didn't go to war. It was more of a trade war. That's why they call it the Cold War.
Trade war, and it was more like the idea of a Cold War is like two barking dogs that never actually go against each other, and also playing this chess game with different proxies. So, you know, the communists or USSR and Cuba, you know, America and other European states, and kind of seeing who can get the most allies, and to basically a full-on ideological war with potential threats. So at one point you had the Cuban Missile Crisis and this idea that a missile could be launched from Cuba and all the different things that were associated there. So there was kind of different instances of threats going back and forth, but nothing actually kicked off. And I think the world couldn't afford for a kick off at that.
They just come out
time.
of World War II.
Yeah.
And also, I think both countries had profound respect for each other, knowing how powerful they both were.
Yeah.
It's actually a really good thing to say. At that point, neither the Russian leaders or the American leaders, they didn't let their ego get the better of them, because it certainly could have kicked off, and we have seen it in smaller cases. I think also something that really helped America was they actually won the space race.
Yep.
You know, they made it to the moon. It's when you're showing the world and America that Lance Armstrong has just landed on the moon, you just put that flag down.
Yeah.
That's iconic. That is truly iconic, because that goes down in history and you can never take it away from America. And it was such a big win because no one had been to space, that it might have been actually one of the nails in the coffin for Russia at that point.
Yeah, 100%.
But one thing I need to touch on, and this definitely is the difference between America and Russia. How much of a factor do you think capitalism plays in making America what it is today? How much of a factor do you think it is to give people financial freedom, the ability to be anything that they want? Because one thing that we can all say about America is it doesn't have a 100% success rate. It probably doesn't even have 50% success rate. But in comparison to the rest of the world, there are very few places where immigrants can travel to, risk their life, and come out successful on the other end.
I think it's a dignified way of life. If you compare it to, let's say, if you live in an elitist, authoritarian society,
which is most of the world, isn't it? Really,
most
outside of Europe,
the non-developed world. Yeah.
Right.
So let's say if you were to look at just an example that I can draw from Iraq right now, if you're an Iraqi and you're, let's say, your age, or you're of the youth, I'd say I'm the youth as well still, but
you are.
If you look at Iraqi youth, they graduate university and they even have a master's degree. They can't get a job in their kind of career because there's two things stopping them, right? They can't get it in a dignified way because, one, the main jobs in terms of civil service jobs are controlled by political parties, and therefore you have to have affinity, you have to have connections to get those jobs. So there's hardcore nepotism, number one, and to be part of that nepotism, you have to compromise your own values, i.e., I'm going to go with this party even though I don't believe in their corruption and all the rest of it, so I'm just going to accept whatever they put on me to get a good salary and to come off, better. Which you can do, and you can strive in that society amongst all the other inequality, right? So that's one side. There's no free market, there's no place for you to go and start your own initiative like a podcast series or your own business ideas, because it's not that kind of society.
Google, Amazon started in garages.
Yeah.
That says everything. And that's why I just had to step in there, because that's the difference. We're talking about people who with degrees can hardly get anything done. And there's someone who's just allowed to create out in the back of the garage. And I think that really has to be dignified and talked about.
Yeah. And with scraps as well, and being able to... having an ideology that's so powerful that it makes you live a life journey where you really take heed of everything that you go through. So you talked about Apple. Steve Jobs, I think he drops out of university, but his step-parents that he has, they're very, very kind of intent. I think the way the fostering process worked was that his step-parents put him through university, which was quite a financial demand on them that was difficult for them to sustain, but they did it nonetheless. He drops out of university and he's sleeping on his friend's dorm couch, and he's going and taking all these different random classes to see what really inspires him. And I think he wanted to go in a particular class, but one day he goes into this lecture hall, sits right in the middle. You know, you've seen some of the lecture halls. Once you're in the middle, you have to get everyone to get up to get out. He goes in there and he doesn't realise it's a 3-hour calligraphy class or lecture. And from there he learns about the different styles of fonts. Now, he didn't want to be there, but somehow he incorporated that many years later into Apple when he started it. And Apple was so many years ahead of Microsoft. If he didn't go into that class in that moment, he wouldn't have come up with the ideas of font, and we wouldn't have seen font at the time that we did in computers. But he was able to process that knowledge and that journey. So many people go through life not appreciating their own journey, things happening for a reason, the bigger purpose, your bigger pursuit of being great. This ideology enables you. So when you compare it to other societies and why capitalism is successful, not just capitalism, the idea, but the other ideological benefits of working in an open, because it's not just capitalism, it's also having the freedoms in a society, the enabling institutions, having a society that enables culturally and socially as well to empower people, because it's not just the money in your work. You also need to have, verbal support, you need to have mental support, you need to have all the other components in place. So I think capitalism is a dignified way of life compared to if you compare it to, let's say, Iraq, for example, and you see, okay, you have to compromise parts of yourself, things that don't sit well with your gut in order for you to succeed. Capitalism is this idea that doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, what colour, creed, race you are, you can come here. This is the land of the opportunity, land of the free. And regardless
home
of, again, the home of the brave. I call Manchester home of the brave, but where we are now. But I'd say it's such an enabling philosophy and such a open society that it enables and it helps people not just see the idea, but also be able to act out. There's steps in place, institutions in place. I think that's why it's been a success for those who've been able to work it. But you're also going to get people in society who look at the negatives. So one of the negatives when I critique America is that it's not as free as you think, and it's not as open in opportunity for everybody. For example, if you're born to an elite family, you have a different startup in life. So one of the things I touch up in my book is George Bush and Paul Bremer, Bremer was the viceroy in Iraq in 2003. Him and Bush went to Phillips Academy in Andover, which is a prep school that gives you better job prospects than if you went to an Ivy League institution like Harvard, Princeton, or Yale. And that means you probably have a salary of around 200k, and it's that prestigious. So, and money buys that opportunity, particular circles, socialization, elite socialization. So if you don't have that, you wouldn't have the same opportunities as those kind of people. But nevertheless, you can do whatever you want to do. You can, as long as you're willing to start from point blank, then you can do it, and this society will serve you and will enable you to do that.
George Bush not only went to a prestigious institution, but his father was also the leader of the free world before he was, and that of course is an advantage. But one thing I want to touch on there is no matter where you go across the world, Bamo, if you have those advantages are everywhere. But the difference between America or the Western world in comparison to many other nations, especially outside of the West, is that you can't do it from the ground up. Wherever you go, that be Iraq, America, China, wherever, even in the most poorest of places, by the way, if you have money, you can live. And I'll give you a story. I was in college, and a friend of mine, an Iraqi friend, he told me he was going back to Iraq, Arab region, so not north where it was a bit more peaceful in the Kurdish regions, but the Arabic regions in Baghdad and stuff. And I remember being shocked, and I was thinking to myself, Ahmed, is it safe? And then we got to talking, and I basically realised something. Ahmed's family was rich. Yeah. So even in a war-stricken country,
yep,
money can buy you safety, money can buy you happiness. Imagine, at the peak of conflict, to go back to Baghdad and live like nothing was going on and actually have a holiday.
Yeah.
In comparison to probably a few people a few miles down from you that are poor,
yep,
where kids are having to forcefully fight in proxies just for a bit of money, kids mine in your age. It says everything you need to know about the world. So I think it's a bit unfair to talk about America in the sense of the elite have it easier, because I think everywhere the elite have it easier. Here in the UK, in England, we know that most of the members of parliament pretty much went to the same university, isn't it?
Yeah. Prime ministers especially, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that type of advantage is everywhere, and people like to give those advantages to their friends and family, because maybe when they get that successful, what else is there to do? How much money is enough money after that to really touch someone's life? You've got to create opportunities for them. So I just wanted to push back on that slightly, not because it's not true, and in an ideal world it wouldn't exist, but unfortunately we don't live in an ideal world. Even in a place like America and in England, where we have the most freedom, there's no such thing as an ideal world.
I think there's that, then there's other aspects as well. So that's just one critique of America, and there's also when theory doesn't meet practice. So you've got this kind of constitutionally embedded idea that regardless of background, colour, creed, race, but we know that America started off with racist attitudes. Slaves aren't equal to, African Americans aren't equal to other Americans, slaves, for example, these kind of things. So that initial issue at the beginning wasn't a small issue. It was a big thing that still to this day, stirs up all different types of conflicts domestically. One of the other things is, if you look at different parts of American history, Americanism has meant different things. So in the 20s, Americanism, to be a good American, it was the KKK. And you had Woodrow Wilson in the 20s actually accompanying the KKK on a march through Washington. And at that particular moment, to be a good American was very much associated with the KKK and their policies, right? The Ku Klux Klan, yep.
I just wanted to say, that would have been specific to an area of America though, right?
Not necessarily.
Are you saying that at that moment in time, wherever you were in America, it was considered to be a good American to be...
The top-down approach, the key officials at that particular time, if you look at kind of in and around Washington, and key institutions, the KKK had mass, ideological support, no doubt.
But that's interesting, because one of the actual heroes of America is Abraham Lincoln, who was against slavery. How did America go from Abraham Lincoln and his team basically winning the war to, in the 30s, like you said, going back to the KKK?
Well, this is the thing. Because America is so divided, its electorate isn't like the UK, where people vote on narrow issues, right? For example, a Nigel Farage wouldn't last 30 seconds in somewhere like America, because people vote for 100 different reasons. Amid those decisions are racist attitudes, love for capitalism, other self-interest, love for their particular state, particular religious views that they have, and even religion has its own divisions and subcategories. And a successful president is the one who can rally up everybody on a particular, issue that brings everyone together, that's cross-cutting above those divides. So what you've had with Americanism is that in different parts of American history, it's meant different things. So in the kind of 20s and 30s, it was very much associated with the KKK and the white man. And, to be a good American, you have to have, you look a particular way. And 50s, with the kind of civil rights movement and the work of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, it turned into no, actually, it doesn't have to be a Clint Eastwood. It can also be a black man, or it can be a black woman, as the kind of image of America or an American. And then, kind of moving on forward from there, you had this New Deal idea that was a big unifying factor. And then kind of fast forward then to Trump, and how it all unfolds again, all the different kind of racist factions that exist in America. All they need is that kind of support and that momentum, and then here you go, you've got this potential civil war brewing again. And you saw how divided America can be on the issue of race, but every successful president has kept these issues at bay.
I will definitely touch on Trump a bit later because, wow, that man is polarizing, to say the least. And there are bad and good elements to Trump. It would be naive to say that he is not an intelligent man in his own right. But intelligence comes in many different ways. But I wanted to touch on beforehand, when we talked about the American dream, I think something that really inspired a lot of people was Obama becoming the leader of the free world. And I keep saying that instead of president, because I think leader of the free world signifies America a bit more.
Yep.
But what do you think about Obama? Not so much in policy, because we can talk about this for hours and whether or not we agree with some of his policies and things that happened. But what do you think about Obama as a symbol for America? Because that goes down in history.
So I would just want to contextualize Obama in the way that I kind of study and teach about his presidency. You had, in the 60s, Million Man March led by Malcolm X and the work of Martin Luther King at the time. This idea that, mobilized African Americans can be a massive destabilizing factor domestically at home in America and internationally for US foreign policy, because theory clearly doesn't meet practice if the world sees this racialized order that America practices at home. With the Million Man March and the mobilization of African Americans was this kind of elite rethink. Okay, we've got a problem that's brewing. How do we deal with it? This goes against our image, it's bad for publicity, and we need to deal with it. So then scholarships started to be created and funded for African Americans to socialize them into elite circles, to not just have leaders that are white over, mass populations of African Americans, to actually have leaders that are from these communities as well, in cabinets, in the House, the Senate, and various other platforms. So Obama essentially was on scholarships, elite funded scholarships, from the age of 9 years old. He was a product of that elite rethink, right? So he was somebody who, on the face of it, his skin might be black, but he's gone through all the elite institutions, elite socializations, elite attitudes and policies. He probably bombed more African countries than any other president.
I think more bombs in general, including a lot in Yemen.
Yeah, 100% more bombs in general. He was the only president to be at war throughout the whole time, active war.
8 years.
Yeah, 8 years. And the other thing was that Obama was this kind of corporate, ideologically conditioned individual. He definitely wasn't this idea. I mean, to the masses, on the surface, it looks like, okay, we've got a black president here and everything's going to change. This guy, he's black on the outside, but his ideas were very much white. And what you have in America is a system, and also the way the liberal international order works, is forget having a great idea. Have an idea that no other idea or order can overcome. This is what America does best. It doesn't just create a good idea, it also creates mechanisms in that idea to manage turbulence. So how it manages its racial divide is it creates leaders from these particular communities who are then able to, by moments of peace in particular periods. So Obama was one of those, but these are called passive revolutions. So whenever you have a crisis that emerges and elites struggle to get people on board, the masses on board with their agendas, you need some sort of passive revolution. This is exactly what happened with Biden and Trump, and I'll talk about that after.
Yeah.
But Obama was this passive revolution. He comes, he looks like he's an alternative. He's not. He's just bringing that legitimacy back to a very divided America at that particular time. And I think after the Republican scandal, which is the only way you can refer to the Bush W presidency, and they call him Derbia because of his George W. Bush. That's what they call Bush Jr. That's the only way to refer to it. So I think as an individual, I was one of those that was in tears, to be honest, when the election came, the results came out and it was all confirmed, because there was so much hope. But then many years later, when I started to really profile different elites, their worldviews, their attitudes, how their backgrounds affect their viewpoints and the policies that they then support, it's clear that you could be a particular skin colour, but if you've been through those socialisation channels, you're going to maintain the order. And it would be very difficult for him to even be the leader of the Democratic list as a main candidate if he was going to come and disrupt the order. And it wasn't about that. He was that passive revolution, surface level.
Obama, though, like I said, politically we can go on about him for hours, and maybe we will bring you back on to just specifically talk about people like Obama. But definitely his policies were not that different. But he was a sense of hope. And sometimes, and that's what I say to a lot of people, sometimes the lie is more important than the truth. Because if you sat down and told future kids from black households that Obama wasn't that great, it wouldn't inspire them as much to tell them that Obama was a symbol and a show of unity. Because by no means is he my favourite leader of America in history, but that's neither here or there. I want to swiftly turn us on to the Iraq War, because then we can talk about Bush more. Definitely talk about Cheney as well. Dick Cheney was a puppet master behind the scenes, which many people didn't realise, with his countries like, his corporations like Halliburton and many others. So let's talk about the struggle in Iraq and give everybody that doesn't know a bit of a background as to why America thought they had the right to go into Iraq. Because Saddam Hussein was definitely by no means a fit leader. And certain things he did, including going after Kuwait, going after the Kurds, going after the Shias.
Yep.
So give everyone a background and then put us onto the Iraq War.
Yeah, so my book specifically looks at this issue in quite detail, because I wanted to know what the truth was myself, but I wasn't really convinced by liberal or realist perspectives and all the other perspectives that existed to say that it was a war that had some mistakes, that these elites made bad decisions, and that basically it was a lesson to be learned for future decision makers. I wanted to know what the roots of the Iraq War were, the motives behind it, and what you basically had was a bunch of elites, over 30 different US elites that were quite unified, and this is from the Bush administration, on a particular agenda for Iraq, to democratize it, to create stability in the Middle East in general, and to create this kind of free and liberal society. Problem was, the idea is great, but then how do you go and implement that in a society so emotional, so etiquette based, in a society where you can't approach somebody in the wrong way? You could go and give somebody a present, but then you give them that present in the wrong way, you could spark World War III. This is the Iraqi man and woman psychology. So they had all the right ideas, I believe, to this day, but I still think the etiquette was completely off. So what you had, just a kind of background, was this American idea for a free Iraq. Starts off with a massive campaign of knowledge production with the Bush Doctrine, us against them, that starts with the Afghanistan war, this kind of the Muslim world, X, Y, Z, we the free American people, ABC, constant comparisons, and this is all, as Edward Said diagnoses, Orientalism. This basically created the conditions for justifying the unjustifiable. These people are backwards, they're barbaric, they're not like us. And this what these kind of rhetorics do, and I'm saying this for the listeners because people miss out these things in wartime. and the impacts that these have for those subject nations. So there's a massive rhetoric that was designed using experts like Bernard Lewis, who again, people who produce knowledge on the East in a very, very pro-Western way about Islam and all the rest of it. So this kind of narrative was constructed. Iraq's a big problem and we need to basically go in. The problem was for Iraq at that particular time was Iraq wasn't really a threat. Okay, it wasn't a big problem for the US. And at the same time, Iraq's main concern for Saddam at that particular moment, which was confirmed later, and I talk about in the book, was Iran. And how Iran would potentially annex parts of Iraq, which now it's done that ideologically, not territorially. And America comes in, heavy bombing campaign. When I talk about justifying the unjustifiable, let's break down all the institutions. 300 Tomahawk missiles were dropped in the first Gulf War of 91. 380 Tomahawk missiles were being dropped every day for a period of like 5 months in Iraq in 2003. And that's like 70% of the total amount ever made at that particular time. Can you imagine the destruction? Telephones lines, schools, hospitals, key infrastructure. And the idea was that we'll go and liberate Iraq, we'll turn it into this free country, but a lot of things will change in that process. So we need to create consent before we bring in these ideas to a very resistant culture. There's a few things that they overlooked. One of those was the fact that Iraq is divided into Sunni, Kurdish, Shia. They don't think like a liberal society. It takes centuries to really get these foundations in place. They overlook the fact that issue politics and democracy wouldn't work there because the majority that are Shia would win the election. People vote on sectarian lines, and there'll be this always marginalisation that takes place, which is exactly what happened with the Sunnis and then ISIS and all the rest of it. They did that, and they had this they were sanctified by the UN Security Council to bring in this coalition, the Coalition Provisional Authority, which was meant to be working with Britain but was mainly American. You had Paul Bremer. The rebuilding of Iraq was all Iraqi money and US taxpayer money that went to US corporations and donor companies that had provided donations to the Bush campaign, who were then awarded massive amounts of contracts. One of those was Halliburton, which Cheney had shares in whilst being in office and had a direct interest in. These were all no-bid contracts, i.e., we need X, just give it to Halliburton, they'll sort it out. And all at massively blown up prices. And the other thing was there was loads of violations of international law in that midst. So, for example, one of the things in international law is, according to Geneva and The Hague, is you can't just go in and pillage and sell off resources or appropriate resources for yourself. One of the things that Bremer did was sell off Iraq's institutions to privatize them. That's all big violations of international law. Going and breaking up the Iraqi army, disbanding it, and then targeting former Baathists, where the majority of the country had to be Baathist, to get anywhere, to get into any job, they had to be a self-professed Baathist openly. So all these different decisions basically went the other way. So all these corporations, I remember there was articles I talk about in my book where US elites were saying, Iraq is like a big yard sale, everybody needs to go and get involved. Pepsi were coming in, all these big banks, all these big corporations, all coming in very, very fast on lucrative deals that were done by the coalition. And also what Bremer did is he brought in 100 laws from Washington, to open up the market, to create immunity for US contractors. So you couldn't be tried if you're a US contractor in Iraqi courts or in US courts. So contractors came in, especially private security contractors, using illegal weapons, illegal bullets that would mushroom out. And I talk about this stuff in the book. All big violations, but because they're a non-US entity, and because of these 100 orders, they can't be tried anywhere. And thousands and thousands of cases like this took place in Iraq. As a result of all this behaviour, and obviously the US were themselves acting undemocratically, picking these elite groups that they wanted to work with. We know the Talibani, Barzani, the SCIRI, Ayad Alawi's party, Ahmad Chalabi's party, These,
Maliki.
yeah, it was part of Jafari's party. These guys were all worked with by the US beforehand, conditioned, and they were kind of, initially the idea was for them to rewrite Iraq's constitution, written by them. Big protests took place, and the minute these guys were selected into the Iraqi Governing Council, which was commissioned by the UN, big insurgency happened. Big people like Ayatollah Sistani came through and said, look, these guys, that's not democracy. And people started to see that actually America's come in, completely destroyed the country, wants to impose its agenda, and has very, very little respect for us and what we want. So what they were basically left with is, what do we do now? Do we just accept this? From there, insurgencies started, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which then became, I think it was ISI, then ISIS eventually. And all the Sunnis, even if you look at the way the constitution was made, which was basically taking those 100 laws, put it into a formal document, and then making a constitution in separate venues. So going and making parts of it with the Kurds in a northern region, parts of it with the Shias, and then imposing the rest of it on the Sunnis. All these decisions had big repercussions. Massive insurgency made it so unprofitable. Corporations by 2006 were running out of Iraq because it was costing them too much. And the insurgency was just beginning then against the elites, against the US occupation, and everything that was planned initially basically didn't go to plan. But in that mix, you had a bunch of US elites that basically benefited from that. And Iraq's still an opportunity for the US to work with and to help rebuild. But I think the approach and the taste and that first impression, lasting impression, it was such a wrong approach in 2003 that basically tarnished the whole reputation of the US and democracy.
You touched on something there. You said the American elites definitely benefited, but so did a lot of Kurdish and Arabic elites, didn't they? They definitely had no problem taking help from a nation that looked like it was ripping it apart from within.
100%, yeah.
But before you expand on that, I want to actually talk about how Ba'athi, as we would say, the Ba'ath regime actually came into power. Do you not think that a group like that comes into power by basically overthrowing the monarch, do you not think that they were always meant for a violent end? Do you not think that a nation led by a man who is willing to go to war with Kuwait, with Iran, Israel, was always destined for some form of destruction, whether or not it was at the hands of Saddam Hussein himself or of America?
Yeah, inevitably 100%. Whatever starts violently will always end violently. There's no doubt about that. And I think Iraq is a prime example. Even before 2003, there were so many revolution attempts that took place, assassination attempts on the president himself, so many different instances. I mean, we had a big movement in the Kurdish region that was brewing and only getting stronger with time. So 100%, I think it was inevitable, and it just happened to come in 2003.
Give people a bit of a background. We as the Kurds had to force the Iraqi, I wouldn't call it occupation, but a huge Iraqi presence out of our Kurdish lands in the early 90s, didn't we?
Yep.
We called it Araparun.
Yeah, I think one of the key things that, I mean, I don't know how it was, you probably had historical context as well, but I never saw Iraq growing up with, let's say, Arab or Ba'athist institutions and police. My dad's generation grew up with that and having spies in the society and Kurdish spies that would feed back to the Ba'athist regime. And I can only, I couldn't even imagine what that would be like. But yeah, there was that kind of big period of loads of kind of working together, if you like, between Kurdish groups to slowly get rid of the Iraqi regime in the Kurdish region.
It was practically a revolution, but I suppose it was one just amongst the Kurds. It definitely wasn't supported or helped by any Shias or Sunnis within Iraq. Just a side note, I want to make sure we don't spend on this for too long. Do you think Iran is headed for this type of demise?
The Iranian regime is in a different position now. The Iranian regime is the biggest winner of the Iraq war. So you got to see it as a etiquette, right? America had the right ideas. It's progressive, right ideas for Iraq. The implementation and its etiquette was completely off. It was offensive. If you look at since 2003, probably from 2005 onwards, the security that one of the things that made America's image become destroyed in Iraq was this idea that they can't provide security to Iraq. You've got a green zone that receives more attacks than any other part of Iraq, right? At that particular time. So Iranians started to provide arms, support to different groups in Iraq, and also
Iranian governments or Iranian people?
Iranian militias, state-sponsored,
Proxy wars.
militias to the Iraqis to maintain order and to create some kind of calm and peace. And other Middle Eastern countries in the region think, okay, if America can't bring peace and stability, which is what it talks about, then we need to look at other options. From there, Iran's role in the region increased. So starting from Iraq, bringing in proxies and militias to create stability, indirectly making them a part of or associated to the government. So political issues, political individuals that become selected, MPs, ministers in key areas, Iran will start to have a political influence in exchange for security inside Iraq. Now that's gone even further. So initially it started as let's provide security, this is our soft power. Then it was let's get our goods in Iraqi markets. If you remember, everything in Iraq used to be Kurdish or Kurdish fruit and all these kind of the produce. Now it's all Iranian. And the Kurdish produce, there's just no investment in it. It's unsustainable and it's actually more expensive than what the Iranians offer it at. So our market now is completely filled with Iranian produce, Iranian goods, Iranian services, from construction to materials, you name it, we're being undercut. The politicians are under pressure for their own security and for the national security and the safety of the people to comply with these different requirements and demands, to the point where the setup in Iraq now is you've got Iranian influence and supported ministers, leaders, cabinet members. You've got Iranian proxy provided national security. They don't just work with one group, they work with everybody. Their approach and etiquette is so effective that through this new cash cow, which is Iraq, their operations in the Middle East have gone through the roof. Economically, it provides funds. I mean, if you look at Palestine, Lebanon, Yemen, obviously we talked about, Bahrain now, Saudi Arabia, even Kuwait. So Iran has become this big regional power because of the US decline in the region. And Iranian strategy since the Iraq-Iran war was to be in a position where if it does go to a war, it has friends, because in the Iraq-Iran war, it was on its own and no Arab states were interested in helping it. Now its whole grand strategy is successful because of what happened in Iraq.
Okay, so we weren't meant to go off on it too much, but it was really interesting actually, so I'll just let you keep going. It's not every day you have somebody with an abundance of knowledge on the actual topic. So that was great, and I could definitely turn it into a specific clip just about Iran. So before that, we were talking about the Iraq war. We talked about the Iraqi elites benefiting as the American elites did. Now I want to touch on the terrorism that followed. Let's put it as a metaphor. If you go into someone's house, you'll face resistance. And if you don't get resistance in one house, you'll probably get it in the following one. Yep. Right? That's just how life works. You don't get to do whatever you like at all times, even if you're America. So that's why I believe, actually, that the presence of Al-Qaeda and ISIS were always credible threats within the region, because the Iraqi people, or people who wanted to spin it in that way, there's a narrative they could have painted. They could have said, look, the Americans are here to help us, or the Americans are here to take from us. And unfortunately, because of the way things played out, because of the way that Saddam was found at the end, a lot of people ended up going to terrorism because for them, it was the only way to get rid of the outsider force. And again, it goes back to us versus them. So we talked about it at the beginning of the podcast, where we talked about it was America versus the rest of the world. Now it was Iraqi Muslims versus the unholy Americans, which we know sometimes they were referred to. And it was an iconic moment, actually, if you remember it. There was one journalist who got up, and I think it was his slippers, and he just dashes them at George Bush.
The shoes,
that became a symbol. To some people, he was unprofessional and unworthy to work as a journalist again, and he was imprisoned. But to many people, and I remember this growing up, to many people, he was a symbol of hope, that man.
Yeah, I think he did a range of extensive interviews. I can't remember his name, but it was a very, very big moment, actually, for summing up the Iraqi attitude towards the US presence. But I think just coming back to what you said about the Iraqi elites, so many Iraqi elites of those initial groups, and I cover this in my book in great detail, Iraqi elites that the US worked with before 2003, how they went on to then dominate the Iraqi political system in key positions of presidency, vice presidency, prime minister, especially deputy prime minister, these kind of roles. And it's all profiled in my book in more detail. But these are individuals who were able to control parts of Iraqi land and then hand that land to friends and family. Money, resources, oil money, institution money, budgets that were then siphoned off to shell companies, friends, families, relatives, even to the point where the current Iraqi president that you have, he was one of those elites in 2003 that as a result of that war became a multimillionaire, and a lot of his assets are pretty much as a direct result of his own embezzlement, if you like. So that's very interesting. You have this generation of elites now that see themselves as kings or as fixed in the history of the Iraqi state, and that's kind of one thing. But definitely, I think the resentment towards America was summed up in that key moment. But what I do know is that Iraq was so ideologically weak, because here you've got divided elite groups, Sunni, Shia, Kurd, with their own factions pursuing their own financial interests.
Their own needs above the needs of Iraq. Exactly.
Iraq doesn't have a national direction. This is what I talk about in the book, and I make recommendations, which I'll also be doing in the book tour. Some very calculated initiatives that would definitely take Iraq forward. And then what you then had from there was a disillusioned populace who basically aren't interested in politics, in making anything change through the ballot box. Disillusioned youth, no opportunities there. And you've got this generation of parents which are telling, who are on the payroll, saying, come on kids, don't say anything, it'll be okay, you've got money, I'm giving you money, why are you complaining? And they're saying, look, well, you're going to die, I'm not going to have a future, so come on son, I'll give you some money, because they're on the payrolls, they're benefiting from that elite system. But for the majority of Iraq, they're not. Every year 700,000 Iraqis enter the job market. 70% of Iraq are under 35. So these are big issues, right? Then you have initiative like ISIS. Listen, you work for us, we'll give you a couple of grand a month. You don't have to beg nobody.
Which is a lot more than what the average person was making.
There's security, it's ideologically sound in terms of as an alternative to what they already have from the Iraqi state and all these divided elite groups. People jumped on board. People like, this is great. People left their jobs in European countries and in American countries to go there and to fight this, because it was a better alternative. And this is what Iraq lacks, that ideology, something that enables people, and it's basically called a cross-cutting identity, that people above the layer of Sunni and Shia and Kurd have issue politics and policies that they vote for. Because even the MPs, if you look at the election time, they come up with all these ideas of, we will make Iraq better, we will provide more jobs, no strategy, no understanding of fiscal or economic policies or anything, of the sort, just generic. But the people, because they're intellectually repressed, they accept these individuals, and it's, if you're popular, or that's my cousin, or I've known him since high school, or he's a good guy who speaks the truth, I'll vote for him, he's better than somebody who doesn't speak the truth. But politics isn't about the truth necessarily, it's about strategy, it's about intellect. And you've got a generation now of intellectually repressed people who are not thinking, how can I put ideas together, thinking, bloody hell, water's coming back in 3 days, oh, you know what, the electricity's back. And I got these things. They're little pauses in your brain flow and your idea compositions. These are things that stop you from cultivating ideas. And there's no study. We don't have institutions that look at the impacts of these, but this fits the elite order. And as part of this consumptive society, you have parent generations who take wages and salaries from Iraq's oil budget through these political parties who hold the institutions. They consume the food at home. Food and produce in Iraq is Iranian, and it serves Tehran perfectly. So we're not going to see progression anytime soon, because this is part of a bigger project to keep Iraq where it is. And you're going to see loads of passive revolutions in Iraq too, like Qadhami, who I have great respect for, but he's the face of very, very deep issue-based political system.
Yeah. A couple of things I want to touch on there. First and foremost, I want to take a little journey up north to Iraq.
Okay.
I want to talk about what happened to the Kurds post-Saddam. And I specifically want to touch on how Jalal Talabani managed to become such a big figurehead and the leader of Iraq at that time. And also, after that, a little mini revolution that did happen was the vote that Masoud Barzani tried to put through with making Kurdistan an actual country. But first and foremost, give us a bit of a background of what happens to the Kurds after the war, and also specifically give us a little journey of how Jalal Talabani became the leader of Iraq, because that was unimagined. Dare I say, a Kurd leading Iraq was like a black man leading America, in a way. Because Kurds are the smallest, well, there's Christians and a small number of Jews as well, but really, we are behind the Sunnis and Shias when it comes to numbers.
Yeah, 17% of Iraq, yeah.
Yeah, so that's not much at all.
No.
So in order to win that election, you needed a big amount of Arabs to vote for you.
I think what he was a compromise candidate. So the system in Iraq is this, it's got a particular name that I can't remember right now off the top of my head. It's the same system in Lebanon. It's this power share where you have a PM, a prime minister who's Shia of the majority, a deputy prime minister who's Sunni, and you have a president who's Kurdish. Now the president role in Iraq is completely ceremonious, so he has as much power probably as me and you do. He's more of like a face, diplomatic ties, and I think Imam Jalal or Jalal Talabani, he was a very, very good politician. He was one of the most loved amongst the different elite groups. He was also able to unify different groups of Iraqi elites and mobilize them very effectively and very skillfully, because you've got to remember that Imam Jalal was different to other Iraqi elites in the sense that he has been dealing with foreign governments and taking trips to Washington and knowing how to deal with different political stances better than his counterparts. So he stood out immediately to the Americans, to Iran, and to his friends in the Iraqi governing council. And then obviously this led him on to be the main guy, to be the president of Iraq, to keep the lid, on the issues. And he managed that successfully. And I think in that regard he was very effective. But at the same time, in a position where there's so many things going on underneath, you have to be very, very easygoing. You have to not really change much. You have to keep things going. The people loved him because he knew how to speak to the people as well. And this is the thing in underdeveloped countries, people have a preference because they believe that individuals take countries forward. It's all about the individual, the reputation, the stature, the way they speak, the way they are. He had all that etiquette. He had good religious understanding. He knew how to speak to people like Ayatollah Sistani. He knew how to speak to the Shias, the Kurds. He knew how to speak to people in Britain, in the US. There's some videos, if you watch, of him going to, for example, different universities in America. Could probably bring a tear to your eye because he's such a marksman when it comes to words. So what happened to the Kurds in 2003? They were the biggest beneficiaries. They, from the get-go, had American advisors. For example, one of those guys is called Peter Galbraith. He wrote a few books, but he was the constitutional advisor, former US diplomat for the Kurds. They were the most organized group in all the constitution making committees, and again I talk about all this in the book in detail, they straight away came forth, we want our own region, autonomy, Peshmerga, our own budget and a federal budget as well. And they were very, very successful. And a lot of the constitution, big parts of it, starting from the temporary constitution, the transitional administrative law, which again I talk about in the book, was made in the Kurdish region, in some of it in Mamjalal's house, other Kurdish officials' places. So they really benefited. And then from there it was Bremer went to the Shias, and then from there it was bargaining with the Sunnis. And the bargaining with the Sunnis was just accept it for now, and if you want to change stuff, there's an amendment process.
You know, that was very ironic because Saddam Hussein was the figurehead for the Sunnis.
Yeah.
For so long, they were the leaders of Iraq, and the Shia were repressed, the Kurdish were repressed, and all of a sudden the tables switch, and now the Sunnis are, hierarchically speaking, probably the lowest in Iraq in ranking or power, which of course they're not going to take lightly, which is what led to the resistance. Jalal Talabani, or Imam Jalal as we refer to him in Kurdistan, for good or for worse, was a great man. I think no one's perfect, but when you look at Kurdish symbols across our history, we don't have that many to be confident about anyway, so it was definitely a hard time for us when he passed away. Because if you recall, he passed away a couple of days after the referendum fell apart. It definitely was. I remember this very clearly. I'm not going to Google it because I'm sure of this. When Barzani set up the referendum to say we want Kurdistan to be independent, Jalal Talabani then died shortly afterwards. He was ill anyway. But for me, Bamo, that was the nail in the coffin. I couldn't see Kurdistan happening. And I get it, he wasn't in power at the time. But you know how sometimes things are just a symbol? Things are just, they indirectly have a meaning. When one of the biggest Kurdish leaders passes away, and we already have turbulence, we already have Turkey telling you can't have Kurdistan, Iraq saying you can't have Kurdistan, Iran, Syria, our surrounding neighbours basically don't want us to have independence, for good or for worse.
I think I contextualise it all in a slightly different way, and I think your ways are quite noteworthy as well. I see mass legitimacy crisis in Iraq since 2011 in the Kurdish region. Goran comes in 2009, exposes these elite practices.
You were a big believer of Goran. Are you still?
I think I wouldn't say a big believer, but they for me represented an alternative hope.
A change. Is, for those listening, Goran in Kurdish literally means change. That's what it translates to.
And I think you could probably say believer because they were the only party in the country, not just in Kurdistan or Kurdish region, who had a strategy, an idea, or a set of ideologies that were progressive for all walks of life. For the first time since the so-called constitution, which was short-lived anyway, and they focused on exposing secretive elite practices. That changed a lot in the region. If you look at Goran comes in 2009, civic movements start to take shape by 2011. And it was like the Arab Spring moment in the Kurdish region of Iraq in 2011.
Kurdish Spring.
Yeah, this was a big thing. Same in 2012. Young kids were killed. Protesters really came through. Journalist rights. Then Barzani came up with this press law to curb press freedoms. There was a big shake-up of the Kurdish political arena. And I think that was a very, very big moment. So there was elites were now discredited. When I say elites, I mean BUK and KDP. Barzani
the only
and
two real
Talabani's,
elites in Kurdistan anyway.
The parties, they were kind of, from there, that was the start of their downfall for me. And then what you also had was 2015-16 quietened down because of ISIS, but people are looking at alternatives. Americans were looking at alternatives in Iraq. So were the British. They're actually looking at Goran as the way things should be: nationalise Peshmerga, depoliticise institutions to kind of change and transform Iraq. But these were so intent on power grabs, they were refused to change and reform things. But now, even they're using, if Goran didn't come in, we would have seen another 10, 15, 20 years of this same system. So then what you've got now is, or what you had by 2016 was ISIS looked like it was starting to be defeated. And people were then focused on the political issues. Where's our wages? Because there was a wage crisis from 2015. Where's our wages? We're sick of this government. We're sick of this rule, whatever. What do you do if you're a leader in a legitimacy crisis? You come and bring nationalism in. Barzani had already stayed past his allowed presidency period, as per the Kurdish region's agreement and constitution. So I was this is what I want to do. It's every Kurdish person's dream, 100%. But you also nowadays, more important than nationalism is strategy for your people and your legitimacy at home. This guy had completely demoralized the region, right? His actions, his, the not being able to deal with any of the crises that we had, mental health was on the rise, comes up with this idea for referendum. And what does it do? It sparks hope for everybody again. And in societies that are intellectually repressed, you can push these ideas to the top of everyone's agenda because this is part of their intellectual paradigm, what they prioritize, what they fight for, what they don't fight for. Mm-hmm. You bring Kurdish opportunity to be a nation, everyone put that at the top, and then we saw what happened.
Yeah, I think 97% of people voted yes on the referendum. It was a very high number. It was high 90s. But so to speak, I think what you're saying is that Barzani tried to write himself in the history books, tried to paint himself as a hero quite forcefully because he clearly didn't have the backing of any political allies. Yeah. And that was the downfall. And I think it took Kurdistan as an idea back, I would even say many decades to come, because after what Barzani did, I don't see a way forward for us to get a legitimate country, especially not through these current leaders.
But do we need the title of a nation? Is that our biggest problem, or do we need a society that has platforms for the youth and channels where you can progress? Look, you get your degree, you get a master's, you go and work, and you can do and be whatever you want to be in a developed society. In Kurdistan, man, I'll never forget, I went to a shop with my cousins. I think I was like maybe 15 or 16, and they were like maybe 7 or 8 at the time. We went to a shop where this 8-year-old, which was my cousin's friend, was running his dad's supermarket. He knew the prices of everything. He was bagging things up. 7, 8-year-old kid. That kid was so advanced at that age, probably more so than any other 7 or 8-year-old, for just his practical abilities and his mathematical skills at that tender age, running a shop, opening it, closing it, all the rest of it, even wearing a shirt that had been cut short with a pocket, just like his dad. Fast forward so many years later when I went back, that kid hadn't developed any more intellectually or in opportunities or in experience. He was in the same position.
Is that because families back home, they rely too much on their children?
Society is not enabling.
Right.
Society, because every parent naturally wants more for their children. When you open a supermarket, you don't open it so your kid works there. You do it so you create opportunities for your children. And every parent, naturally, I have kids, you want the best for your children, but the society doesn't allow it. There's so much uncertainty outside. Mm-hmm. There's uncertainty here as well, but it's manageable, and you can turn it into progressive initiative. This is the best that you can kind of accept and stay with, and these are the kind of things that sum up the crisis that we have in that region after the US occupation.
Gosh, I want to talk about this all day, but there are other topics that we need to get into. One thing I would say though, do you think it's because the Kurdish people, the parents that came before us, they spent so much time just fighting for freedom that they couldn't see past the idea of being small-minded in a sense? They couldn't be intellectually prepared because instead of being at university, they were Peshmergas in the mountains and they were fighting. They were resistance for us. And had it not been for them, me and you might not even exist.
True. And you can't blame the people because they're intellectually repressed, right? As we said, and they only know what they know. But at the end of the day, that doesn't mean that you accept things as they are. Things still have the opportunity to grow, to change. So many allied countries said no for that referendum. Yeah. So many people were disadvantaged. Their lives, day-to-day lives, were affected by the policies of Kurdish elites, yet they chose to support this initiative. it should have been received in a completely different way. But at the same time, it was such a historic opportunity that you wouldn't be a true Kurd if you didn't vote yes in that and take
You
part.
have to vote yes. Do you know what? Do you know what I wanted? A bit more. Not necessarily for us to get Kurdistan handed on a plate, because that's not how life works. Like, that's just not how the world is going to operate. But the disrespect we saw from our surrounding neighbours was something I'll never forget. Honestly, Turkey saying they will cut off water lines.
Yep.
Iran basically funding the militia that came to take Kirkuk forcefully. You know, we talk about etiquette. It certainly doesn't exist in the Middle East, whether it's among Kurds, Shias, Sunnis, Iranians. Some people will be upset by my comments, but there is no etiquette within the Middle East, because even if, let's say, California right now turned around and said, we want to be an independent country, you will not see people from New York coming down and trying to take it by force.
Yep.
So when we talk about the Middle East, one of the reasons why it might never progress is because truly some of the most egotistic leaders come from that regime. And do you know what it is, bro? It's like when you hear enough for many decades that you are everything and you are the supreme leader, then surely you're going to start believing your own hype.
Definitely, I think in our culture, it's not a critical culture generally. Like, those around you have nothing but respect and love, and you know, they're constant. Yeah, and that creates problems because you never really hear the truth. You don't hear ways to improve things or to change things. You just keep getting affirmations, and in the case of particular elites, it's the wrong affirmations, and it's caused so many issues. But again, it comes back to education. Any individual who's studied even political science at a basic level knows that ideas and institutions take countries forward. But in the Middle East, if you don't have that education, I mean, you are looking at an Iraq now where the president of the Kurdish region was a Peshmerga. So, you know, so was his
Father.
Yeah, you know, so was his father, and then his nephew, who's president now. And even Iraq's, you know, president wasn't a master of political science, nor was the prime minister that we have now. He was like a journalist who's become the prime minister. So nepotistic societies are always open for that. And if you have people who don't have that understanding at the top, and they're not drivers of ideas and institutions, instead they're constantly being reactive, because you either have a proactive country that deals with today whilst preparing for tomorrow and has a progressive generation and system, or you have a reactive nation and leaders. That's what we have in Iraq. There's a problem, let's try and sort it, but some things can't be sorted. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi youth, Kurdish, in the Kurdish region, go into the job market every year, no prospects. Their peak time of their brain development and their, you know, life is now being squandered because there's no opportunity and nowhere to go.
Just putting Kurdistan aside, even in Iraq and a lot of places in the Middle East, what we need above all is a free market, just to allow people to work properly and prosper financially. But to finish off in the last 10-15 minutes of this podcast, I want to go back to America. I want to talk about Trump, and I also want to talk about the recent divide that you're seeing amongst the left versus the right in America. A very powerful nation that might, I don't think it will happen anytime soon, but might destroy itself. So you know how we talked about the Iraq war, Iran was the biggest winner. I think in the financial crisis, China was the biggest winner.
Yeah.
Because what it did was, if you put it metaphorically, America and China are racing. America is laps ahead, but it falls over. And in that period that it gets back up, China's now catching up. Yeah, let's touch on the divide, left versus right, and let's talk about Trump.
Okay, we'll start with Trump. I think Trump was the prime example of the American dream.
I was just going to say that.
You know, the guy who, and his intellect is like he's from the people. He's nothing special. He doesn't speak in Harvard jargon or Wall Street jargon. He's very simple. He's reality TV kind of guy, well followed, well known, and he's an inspirational figurehead of the American dream already. So he's got popular support.
Definitely.
And I think what Trump also brought to the table, amidst all the kind of popular support side, I mean, Republicans were in a bit of a crisis after Bush.
Yeah.
That was a big problem. Like, how do we regenerate support for the Conservatives again? And I think he was one answer. What you have to remember is that Trump had his own ideas. He was, because as I said to you, Americans are all different. Families fall out because of the Democratic and, you know, Republican votes, for example. Some people really can end up in divorces, believe it or not, because one's, Democrat, one's Republican, etc. So that's a big problem inside America. Trump comes in. He is one of those Americans that's quite racist, holds particular views of parts of the world, and also China is, getting ahead quite fast, or too fast for America's liking. So there needs to be some drastic change. He comes in, he's going to be the face of it. But underneath Trump, and again, coming back to ideas and the role of big money and knowledge networks, you've got billionaire corporate foundations funding ideas and movements like far-right movements, Unite the Right rallies, for example. And these are all very, very racist, not too far from KKK in terms of ideology, believe it or not. Not as violent, but kind of making America great again, and predominantly believing in a white America. Now, when you have millions of dollars funded into those ideas, into so-called volunteers being paid, that creates movements. That then also looks like on TV that this is very, very popular and this is the will of the people. So you had Trump on one hand, and you had those ideas, right-wing billionaire foundations funding movements as well, which created the support for him. He comes in, brilliant moment for America and China relations in terms of catching things up, in terms of the economy, and bringing in some policies that would be otherwise hard to justify with any other leader, but also a very, very problematic moment for America that basically exposed the domestic divide and potentially put them on the brink of civil war again.
Okay. I want to first push back on the point that Trump was racist, because do you recall Jesse Jackson? He tried to run as an independent, I believe. Was it once or twice they tried to run? Both times he was heavily supported by Trump, and Jesse Jackson, as you know, is a black man. It's not that I'm trying to rectify what you said about Trump. I'm more trying to get inside your head a bit. So this is a man who funded Jesse Jackson. This is a man who's a huge part of pop culture, because Trump was very famous. Rappers would put him in their lyrics. Rappers are predominantly black, of course. He was seen as a symbol of the American dream, for example. My view of Trump in 2016 wasn't that he was a racist, but an opportunist. So here's what I think he saw. Trump saw that the country had been led by a Democrat for 8 years. So first and foremost, his first catchphrase is, Democrats can't do anything. Secondly, we're seeing America go in decline, and it's involved in a lot of wars. So one thing that Trump did, to the detriment of the Kurds, by the way, was pull out a lot of troops in the Middle East. And then he was like, let's make America great again. Why was that an easy sell? I'll tell you why. Because they didn't do well under Bush for 8 years. They didn't do well under Obama for 8 years. So now you have 16 years of nothing but pure turbulence for the American people. So Trump was an easy sell. I think the reason why Trump realized he had to kind of, let's say, feed to that racist side of America, which we all know exists, is because he knew that a lot of middle-class Americans might not vote for him irrespective of his policies, because he is a Republican. Because as you know with politics, and that comes to the UK as well, some people are lifelong Labour voters, are Conservative voters. Listen, if you're a lifelong voter of anything, you're basically telling me there's been no growth in your mind. So that's the argument I want to offer to you. I don't think Trump was a racist because he was he was friends with many black people, so on and so forth, but I think he was an opportunist.
My understanding of America is that the American voice, the American president, for example, at my job now as a lecturer of American, foreign policy and domestic politics, there's thousands of analysts worldwide that are waiting on the end of the US president's speech or decision or policy to see how it affects any part of the world. You're looking at the biggest aid provider, biggest funder of the UN,
obviously World Health Organization.
Yeah, WHO, all the liberal institutions, and the aid packages like US aid, for example, is a big thing. What America does and says and believes is powerfully recorded all around the world. No other country do you know about their president, their, as we've talked about, the soft power. When I say Trump the racist, you can do all that. You can have racist views, but also have people who are your friends. Jesse Jackson will be probably for his own interest or for whatever reason, or maybe he shares similar views to Trump. It's difficult to kind of ascertain all those.
But surely trying to put a black man in power takes you away from that.
But then you look at Obama and how he was, for example, African Americans.
He was anti-Obama. He definitely was.
African Americans were worse off in 2007. They were even more worse off in terms of wealth inequality by 2017. So even a black man doesn't necessarily serve the interests of African Americans. Americans know that.
They don't. I'm sorry, I have to say that a lot of what's going on right now all over the world, not just in America, is pure identity politics, and that won't take us anywhere. And companies like CNN and Fox are basically fueling this fire.
Exactly.
So when you say you know that, with all due respect, a lot of people don't. Like I said, a lot of people are going to spend their whole life voting Labour, and a lot of people are going to spend their whole life voting Conservative. That's identity politics.
Yeah.
Who's going to get anywhere with that?
No, 100%. But I think America's ideology still manages to overcome that kind of divide successfully, and it brings different people on board. And you said about voter blocks. Trump was very, very smart. He managed to identify that there's loads of white Americans, not just pure white Americans, white Irish, white Italian Americans that are kind of, you've got, American, and you've got Irish, Italian American,
the immigration.
Scottish, the ones that are white and have integrated over different generations, numerous generations, they're considered more American than African Americans to the white Americans, right? He managed to reconcile those whites without degrees, using a rhetoric that what have these nonsensical wars done for us? What has Americanism done for you without a degree? Because all the jobs are going to those that have got all the qualifications. So he unified people with very limited education, very limited understanding of politics, but he had a narrative: we're going to make America great, and it's about ordinary people. Loads of these volunteers that Koch and Soros funded, these different groups, and these are in the millions, took these ideas on board, make America great, carry the flag, wear the hat, and it was this kind of new unquestioned reality. That's how he edged the election. But at the same time, he's going to have a conservative following as well. He is an embodiment of the American dream. For a lot of youth at the same time would vote for him. A lot of women, even though all these things were out about him, how his attitudes towards women. One of the videos you're saying, like, you can touch them, you can do whatever you want to women, and they love it. They won't say anything because you're famous. Then when he came on TV, and I think it was Latina Miss World, and he said, "Oh, that's Miss Housekeeping," that, because Latinas do housekeeping in America. And I think another time he was like, "Look at my African American friend, just look at him." He's looking at him as if he's objectifying him in a bad way. These things, when I say racist, Trump might not have ingrained hatred towards African Americans or other races. That may not be the case. But when you say that, you verbalize something like that, as the US president, be prepared for absolute shifts.
Culture.
Exactly. And you look, and I write this in my book, when Martin Luther King questioned America, he didn't hate America or white people. He questioned, or even Malcolm X, he questioned the fact that America claims to be this one thing, but it's acting or saying otherwise, right? Or behaving in a different way. It's being inconsistent to its own principles. Trump's making even these comments, even one comment, from the stuff he said about Mexicans to all these other things, this fuels turmoil. You'll have African Americans who feel ingrained in American, or feel embedded in American culture and society, and identity is ingrained in them. And they hear that, and that sparks all the tension, the divide out of them. And that's essentially what happened. It was this kind of unifying these white supremacist groups and BLM movements. Now, what happens with these groups, and when you fund ideas, like what the Soros brothers and the Koch brothers basically did, was this idea of putting these ideas into institutions. So how all these, one of the chapters that I worked on actually recently was about how this issue of hardcore racism and extreme conservative right-wing views are now in the institutions like police and other areas now, and how this then impacts the way they deal with particular groups of African Americans in particular areas. So it all kind of disseminates in a really destructive way. And I think that's what I focus on the racist side, that as a US president, you can't even whisper something that even can be, you can't even breathe in a way that maybe seem racist.
I think the problem is when you're Trump and you've been a billionaire your whole life and you keep getting away with things, even when you become the leader of the free world, you probably don't change some of your rhetoric. That goes without saying. I think covering Trump, he's a polarizing character and you're not going to come to a conclusion talking about him even for 2 days straight.
No.
So there were some highlights and obviously some very bad moments to his presidency, including what happened pretty much just before he left in Washington. The good thing was the unemployment was down, was the lowest they'd had in America. But I think Trump was a soundbite in a way. Look at the way people convey information these days. The fact of the matter is most people don't do their research. But Trump was popular because he was always a good soundbite. He was always telling you what you wanted to hear in a very entertaining manner.
Hyperboles. He writes it in his book. Always use hyperboles, that people like to hear things. You're the biggest, the best.
You know, that's where I think the left really missed the ball, because they kept trying to feed you that Trump was stupid. No, my friend, Trump was very smart. But you were fighting the wrong war against him. And I actually think where Trump lost the presidency wasn't in his actual term. Well, no, it was in his term, but it was during COVID. When he didn't take COVID seriously, I think that's when he lost a lot of voters, especially the older voters. And when some of his goons went too far, I think that's when he lost. Now, simply, my opinion is, had it not actually been for the breakout of COVID and then the rising of BLM, we would still be under a Trump presidency right now. However, the resistance was real and Biden was voted in with the most amount of votes in history, if I remember correctly. So that in itself carries weight and tells you the detriment that Trump put America through. Now, you could say people had less to do and it was during COVID and, you know, they weren't as busy, so they all went out to vote. But I would say no, you got to be fair and say Trump really did a number on the American people.
He definitely won an election. You know, there's no doubt about that. But when you get there, it's like all positions in life. Some people work so hard to get the dream job, but then when they get there, they think the hard work's over. It starts there, maintaining it. And I think Trump was, the only president as well that was campaigning throughout his whole presidency, always on tour, if you like. But people were exhausted as well by his constant domination of the news. What's he done next? People were sick of the name, to the point now where there's this kind of enjoyment of the calm. So you don't hear anything about what America's gone back to good old diplomacy and US
America's
aid.
gone back to being passive. Now let's make one thing clear. The border crisis is worse now than it was under Trump. But under Trump it was highlighted more because Trump was saying things like, let's build a wall. You know, so again, some people, I've come to realize through experience, some people are not very good at articulating their speech. And Trump at times is one of those people. Having said that, America's issues are far from over. I think Biden and Camilla have a huge country on their hands to fix. I don't know if they'll get re-elected. They probably will. But I'm hoping for the sake of the people and the actual economic growth of that country. We don't want it to stop because they're giving us a lot, let's be honest. For the sake of those people, Biden and Camilla have to come through.
Yep.
Because God only knows what will happen if riots start again. Because then you know what that fuels? The far-right racists.
Yep.
You get anarchy.
I think what you'll see, though, with Biden and Camilla is it's another passive revolution. It's nothing, no president will be a major shift away from elite interests. Because the way knowledge works in America and the way institutions operate and the way ideas are funded, there's bigger control mechanisms than for individuals to come in. In the Middle East, 100%, yes. A leader can come in and start doing all sorts of different things because, let's face it, there's no immediate history of pride and ideology to fall back on. America's ideology keeps it on track. And even if it veers off now and again, like Trump, it will find a way back.
And I'm very eagerly waiting for another. I've not actually read this previous book, but I'm waiting for this next book because I think it'll be very interesting to see how a man like him has now set a blueprint for non-politicians to come into power. But only in America can you be a non-politician and lead the free world. And I think that's a great soundbite to go off, because that really does exemplify that, yes, Trump was a billionaire, I get it, he was inherently rich, but that is opportunity, brother. That is opportunity, and maybe even through all its faults, America is an embodiment of opportunity.
100%.
We're running out of time, and I just want you to tell everybody about your book, where they can find it, when they can find it. Let everybody know, and then we'll have to conclude.
Yep, so it's out on September 10, Elite Theory and the 2003 Iraq occupation by the United States, how US corporate elites created Iraq's political system. So yeah, out September 10. It's on all major platforms globally, so you can find it from, if you're in the UK, from WH Smith to Waterstones to Amazon and all the other big. And
you can download it as well on a Kindle.
Yeah,
or
I think you can do ebook. Yeah, so yeah. I'm presuming it'll be a Kindle edition as well. And funnily as well, talking about US corporates, my book argues that there's corporate elite networks that produces leaders and gets them into power, and it's corporate ideas that become US foreign policy. So that intricately explains everything in the context of the Iraq war, from ideology to policy on the ground. So yeah, September 10.
Listen, bro, this has by far been the best podcast I have done so far. It's also, I can already tell, the longest podcast we've ever done. This has been amazing. I'm sure everybody would ask for you to come back on again. Thank you very much for being here, and welcome. Take care, everybody.
Take care.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.